Hello, my name is Keenan Colquitt Jr. I'm the program lead for the Diversity Scholars Network, a scholarly community operating within the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, at the University of Michigan. As your host, I am pleased to welcome you to the first event of our Hot Off the Presses speaker series. NCID's mission is to produce, catalyze, elevate diversity scholarship, which we define as our developed framework as a scholarship that helps advance our understandings of processes, phenomena related to difference, inequality, culture, identity, power, and oppression. Diversity scholarship considers how these areas impact individuals, groups, institutions, communities, and societies. NCID's vision is operationalized through engagement opportunities like the Diversity Scholars Network, or DSN. The DSN seeks to foster academic, educational, social connections, and environments that facilitate the professional success of diversity scholars. Our view of success includes individual scholars' self-defined professional goals and also reflects a holistic approach. That is, we aspire to create environments that support scholars in their sense of community and connectedness with others who share the professional values and commitments, enrich intellectual engagement and exchange, and in their personal and professional development and thriving as whole individuals. The DSN consists of over 1,000 members, representing over 200 institutions across the world. Our application process is currently underway. We invite faculty across all ranks, tracks, appointment types, research staff, postdoctoral fellows who conduct diversity research and scholarship to become members of the DSN. Information on that process and the DSN are available on our University of Michigan website and will be posted in our chat. Today's event, Data Don't Speak for Themselves, a panel presentation that will highlight the recently published book, Behind the Diversity Numbers by W. Carson Byrd. In addition to being a member of the DSN, Dr. Byrd was a scholar in residence with NCID and UMich's Society Department from 2019 to 2020. He completed the work of this text during his residency. The NCID Scholar in Residence program provides an opportunity for senior diversity scholars to pursue their research and writing at the University of Michigan. This residential fellowship specifically supports scholars doing work to further our understanding of historical and contemporary social issues related to identity, difference, culture, representation, power, oppression, and inequality, with the goal of advancing equity and inclusion throughout our society. Dr. W. Carson Byrd is currently a senior fellow in residence at the National Center for Institutional Diversity. He is also a member of the 2021 cohort of William T. Grant Advanced Quantitative and Computational Scholars for the Institute of Critical Quantitative, Computational, and Mixed Methodologies. As a sociologist, his research uncovers and links the manifestations of radicalization within educational environments to broader patterns of social inequalities in society by elaborating how educational institutions, especially colleges and universities, can simultaneously amplify and reduce inequalities. The complicated relationship between education and racial inequality has led him to explore the racialized experiences of college students, including the association of inter and intra-racial interactions with students' identities and racial ideologies, and their navigation of different degree pathways that often result in disparate academic and social outcomes. His work also explores the racialization of science and knowledge production, includes discussions of genetics, genomes, and inequality that can influence what students learn in STEM classrooms, what they view as viable career paths, and why inequalities exist on campus and in their communities. He has published extensively on race, education, and inequality in peer-reviewed journals, edited volumes, and in public forums such as the Washington Post, Inside Higher Ed, the Chronicle of Higher Education. His first book, Poison in the Ivy, Race Relations and Reproduction of Inequality on Elite College Campuses, published in Rutgers UP, examines college students' interactions with one another and how these social interactions influence what they believe about race and inequality. He also recently co-edited a collection of empirical-based intersectional analyses of college campuses, intersectionality and higher education, identity and inequality on college campuses. Turning now to his most recent text and this book talk, which centers on Behind Diversity Numbers, Achieving Racial Equity on College Campuses. The book explores how the framing of racial inequality in conjunction with the over-reliance on quantitative methods for diversity, equity, and inclusion can shift universities from tackling racism as a systemic issue that requires organizational change to individualizing inequality as the deficits of people. Today's conversations will highlight theoretical concepts and current research associated with the use of statistics within systems of higher education and the possible adverse effects of the misuse of these numbers can have on minoritized student groups. NCID is thrilled to welcome an exciting and interdisciplinary group of diverse scholars to lead us in this conversation on research and recognition. Please help us build this and other NCID programming by completing our post-event survey displayed in your web browser after discussion ends. Thank you again for joining us today. And now I will turn the program over to our featured scholar and panel moderator, Dr. W. Carson Byrd.
Thank you, Dr. Colquitt. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for a conversation about something that many may view as mundane or maybe even ran away from as kids, numbers. When I entered college, I found the power of numbers for transforming conversations about how we understand the world around us. And noticed that for a lot of people, what would happen is somebody would bring the numbers from research and people would listen more attentively, it seemed. At the same time, the more I learned about these numbers, the statistics and how they were used in education, the more I became interested in how people arrived at their usage to inform policies and institutional decision-making. I wondered who got to say how a group was constructed and how the interpretation of the numbers overrode a wealth of qualitative data we had as well. For example, you might have noticed that there's a lot of anti-affirmative action cases going on where race-conscious admissions policies at many colleges and universities are under threat. And one of these, for example, is Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, right? These cases usually hinge on the statistics of researchers, and what is rarely heard and sometimes kind of seen as abnormal are the actual voices of the people and their experiences. Instead, the numbers tell the stories for the lives of people in an arguably dehumanizing way that make people interchangeable and analyzable data points. And so these and other questions led me down the path to writing this book, which examines how colleges and universities utilize what's known as quantification to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion on their campuses, and what issues we should be attentive to when using such approaches to understand campus life. So before I jump into an overview of the book to kind of kick off our conversation, I want to briefly introduce our panelists that will join me today and mention why I'm really excited that they were able to be here. First is Dr. Katherine Cho, an assistant professor in student affairs and higher education at Miami University in Ohio. Her work centers on institutions and their potential to change and transform, to move closer towards social justice and in their reality of maintaining systems of oppression and manifesting harm. Her work spans student activism, institutionalized racism, retention efforts, and flipping the narrative of why aren't students prepared for college to why aren't colleges prepared for our students. A large segment of her work focuses on institutional responses, or the lack thereof, to campus racism. Her work is a model for how to conduct student-centered research, not just on students and their experiences, but in collaboration with students as well. Next is Dr. Carly Ford, who is an assistant professor in education policy studies at Pennsylvania State University, who focuses on the sociology of higher education and race and ethnicity in data collection. Her work is fascinating and uncovers the variations in how colleges and universities report students by race and ethnicity that not only changes how the campus looks according to the data, but also how they cultivate what she calls a cosmetic diversity in the presentation of the same data on their websites, particularly as data about multiracial students and those whose race and ethnicity groupings are unknown are concerned. Dr. Ford's work provides an important window into the malleability of everyday processes of racial and ethnic categorization, and how these approaches to data tend to support the narratives higher education institutions want to present about racial diversity and inequality on their campuses that can influence what we think needs to be done to change the inequities around us. Last but not least is Dr. Jameson David Lopez, an assistant professor of educational policy studies and practice at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on Indigenous statistics, survey research, and Indigenous data collection with the hope that his experience in research incorporating Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific methods will continue to support all generations of Native American people. Dr. Lopez is at the forefront of pushing not just our methods and theoretical perspectives to better represent and hear from and of Native American students and their communities, but for our research and the organizations and universities we are in to be more accountable as well. As one brief example of how innovative his work is, in a recent Journal of Diversity in Higher Education article, he expands our usage of factor analytic strategies to build on Indigenous knowledge and quantitative methodology to highlight how students continue to be connected to their communities while in college in critical ways. His work can help people wanting to understand how to better incorporate theory into methods in multiple ways and to avoid distorting and dehumanizing communities through research endeavors. So I want to welcome all three of our panelists. And before we get into this conversation a little bit more, I want to share some of the highlights of Behind the Diversity Numbers, the book that we're focusing on today. And you'll find out more about each of our panelists' research as we get into this conversation a little bit more, and hopefully you'll follow up with them and their work and utilize that more in your classroom and your own research endeavors and decision making as well. So Behind the Diversity Numbers sits along two main theoretical views. One is looking at colleges as what's called as racialized organizations, which has been put forth by Victor Ray. And the other is quantification, so numbers. Right? So for the racialized organization framework, one of the things that has to be put to the side is the general use of history, or should I say not use of history, for understanding how race and racism has always been at the heart of what our colleges and universities have pursued. Many of you have probably seen Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder that gives a great in-depth history of this for many of America's early colleges. And so oftentimes we talk about race as if it enters colleges, not that it's always been a part of college. Right? And so this history really brings out what colleges and universities have done. And what is important about this is we all need to interrogate what these histories are for the institutions and our locations in relation to them, to understand a little bit more about how race and racism is a part of how our colleges operate. So when we think about racialized organizations, there's three main features, right? The first is understanding that organizations are meso-level structures, right? And so for those of you who are not too much into the abstract theory, I promise this will be brief, but it'll also be applicable, okay? So organizations can be vehicles for racializing people, right? In spaces and places and knowledge, and then attaching that racialization to opportunities and resources. So the material reality of why race matters, right? And so schemas are the common sense or the unwritten rule book explaining how to write the rules for organizations. So why does an organization function the way we think it should? Or maybe it should change, right? And so these are about everyday processes that make things normal and legitimate. So if we think about faculty, for example, we know that faculty are generally evaluated about teaching, research, and service. And we also know that in many cases, service is not given the same weight as teaching and research. And when we kind of dig into this literature, we also see that faculty of color, especially women, do disproportionate amounts of service to their institutions. And this can be a detriment to their career endeavors. And so the scheme is, it's clear what universities should be, or what faculty should be doing to get tenure, for example. But what the disconnect is to do what is needed for tenure. You need to say no to those service, opportunities, as if these aren't meaningful for part of the jobs that you do, right? So the schema and the solution is disconnected from the organizational inequality that are facing faculty of color, right? And so the ideology then comes in, right? And racial ideology is the frameworks that we use to explain, justify, and challenge racial inequality and why it exists. So again, if we see that more faculty of color are getting denied tenure, and we see that they have more or heavier service loads, then why aren't those faculty doing what they're supposed to get tenure? Not that they're not seeing why there's a disproportionate service load or why that service load matters in many ways to that institution that is devalued in the review process, right? So this brings us to the second part, quantification. And so quantification is a process that provides numeric representation for people, experiences, and social phenomena, and truncates complex societal aspects into manageable, observable units. It makes things simpler, right? And so the process that leads to this is through a network of actors that use quantitative methods and tools to guide decisions, right? So if we see that a certain percentage of people are really wanting us to talk about climate change and we're on a political campaign in a certain area, then we might want to talk about climate change a little bit more for votes, right? Numbers kind of help us make sense of what we might want to do. And through a four-stage process, quantification starts to change how we understand the world, right? So the first is categorization. That's the creation of bins to put people, experiences, phenomena. The second is classification, which are the rules for how do we understand where people go and why, right? The third is enumeration, which is counting. And then the fourth is valuation or assigning a value. And so things can become more quantitative or become dequantified. And if you're really interested in this, I definitely want to point you to some of the work by Dan Hirschman, Ellen Berry, and Fiona Rose Greenland, who do a nice job of kind of looking at what does quantifying and dequantifying processes look like in college admissions. And so when you think about this through the sociology of race and ethnicity, for example, you start seeing how quantification also mimics processes of racialization, right? And so with that, we can see how the diversity numbers, if you will, how we understand racial and ethnic diversity and inequality on our campuses reflect that racialization process, right? And how quantification can lead to changing how we understand who's on our campuses, their experiences, and maybe what we should be doing. And so through the re-articulation of diversity through measurement, analysis, and policy in higher ed, this showcases how universities perpetuate and shift the racialization of bodies and experiences that can then change what resources and opportunities are going to be given to people, right? And so what I do in this book, just for a little bit more background before we jump into the questions, is I look at three areas. One is college admissions, which is always a really interesting space and topic to discuss, and look at how quantifying or quantification works in that area of higher education. The next is the data, right? Who do we know is on campus? What are the processes that lead to us figuring out what that image of our institutions look like? And then the last kind of substantive discussion diving into the data is looking at campus climate research, which has grown in importance and breadth over the last 30 years? And how has that connected to the organizational changes we want, or maybe not connected as well to that? And then the last chapter is kind of the big picture stuff. But speaking of the big picture, I also want to dive in a little bit more to some of the questions that our panelists have. And so with that, I know that was quite brief, so I apologize, but hopefully you'll get a little bit more from our conversation here. And so I believe Carly has the first comment and question about the book.
Yeah, thanks, Carson. Since this is a book launch or talk, I just wanted to take a few minutes to tell everyone what some of the things that I really love about the book and celebrate it for a moment. I think this is one of the rare academic books that crosses a wide variety of audiences. So there is a lot of great stuff in this book for sociology of education types who are interested in higher education and stratification. There's a lot of great stuff in here for people who are interested in higher ed policy. And I've already seen Twitter, the higher ed policy people get into this book pretty in depth. This book is also for academic researchers who use race as a variable in their work and want to better understand it. And this book is also for people who work in higher education. If you work in student affairs, in institutional research, the people who do the on-the-ground work to collect the survey data for the climate survey and then crunch those diversity numbers, this book is also for you. And so I think the wide audience for this book really speaks to why there's been so much interest in it and so much interest in this event today. I also have a few things. Okay, so in the course of the book, Carson, like a very good social scientist, comes to, sort of tempers his claims and conclusions and says that there's no one size fits all solution, that you need to think about context and institutional type. And so, of course, that is good social science. However, there are other places in chapter 2 where Carson pulls no punches and really lays it out for people. And those are the parts that I liked the best. So he's very strong in telling the audience or the reader, don't look for individual solutions for organizational and structural problems. And I think if you take anything away from the book, that is a really strong message. He's very careful to talk about race as a social construct and a lived reality. And there are at least 42 endnotes. So if that is not something that you really understand deeply, he's really left you a lot of breadcrumbs to figure out what social construction means along with lived reality. He's very straightforward in saying, for the love of God, stop using the term Caucasian. It's a holdover from eugenics. So that was a very clear message. And then also the term resident alien, I wrote down this Carson quote: "No person is an alien in humanity, and people from other countries deserve to be treated with respect, even in statistical conversations." So there's so much heart in this book and voice in this book. The last thing I want to celebrate before I get to my question is the foreword. So for people who don't know, Walter Allen is a great in the study of race, in education, in sociology. And he really legit wrote this foreword. He contextualizes this book, its messages, and where it fits into a larger conversation. So of course you should read the whole book, but also read the foreword. And if you are writing a book and you need someone to write your foreword, I would give them this foreword as a template, as a really seriously good foreword. Okay, so my question for Carson is about chapter 2. On page 72, there is a very cool looking figure where he is talking about the University of California race data categories and how they report to iPads using the standard reporting categories, but then they also use a set of I don't know, 72 other categories that they can disaggregate and aggregate up. And so I've squinted at this figure for a while, but I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about what it means to you and how it connects to the argument of chapter 2 in the book.
Sure. And first, thanks for all the praise. When you write a book, you're not really sure if it's going to hit, and if it is, how, and if it's actually going to end up hitting you back in some negative way. So it's always nice to hear that things resonated. And so, as Carl was pointing out, there's a lot of different ways, if we think about quantification and how it's applied in higher education, to understanding race and ethnicity. And one way is how institutions report their data. And so the University of California is one of the leaders in trying to change the perspective of who's on their campus by changing how they report data. And so they have a wide range of categories, as Carla was mentioning. And when I was sitting down to kind of dive into what could be some better ways, the one thing that kept resonating in my mind was how hard it is to use the U.S. Department of Education's IPEDS data to really get at what some of the racial and ethnic inequalities on a campus might look like, and for some comparisons, see what institutions might be doing better, who might not be, things like that. And so this then led to this juxtaposition between these two reporting approaches. But one of the things, as Carla was mentioning, the University of California, as an institution that receives federal financial aid, has to report data. And so the question became, how do you take something with so many categories and fit it within so few categories like the IPED system requires? And so this took me on a journey through what is who's represented in the data, and what are the processes of getting to those IPED categories. And what you'll find in this chapter, especially in this one figure that Carla pointed out, was there's a lot of changes, right? So first you have to consider nationality, right? So for IPEDS categories, for example, when it comes to race and ethnicity, all US citizens are categorized using race and ethnicity. If you are not a US citizen, if you're an international student, for example, you get put into the unfortunate category of non-resident alien student, which is very, very vast, right? And so it makes it really hard to compare outcomes and experiences with this data just on that fact alone. But when you start looking at the University of California's system and applying that same kind of approach and working your way towards IPEDS, you start seeing that nationality matters, but also which aggregation approach. Like the University of California has its own aggregation approach that is slightly different from the IPED system. Also, what happens with people who identify with one or more races and ethnicities, right? IPEDS does not necessarily allow for multiracial individuals to be counted the way they, fill out forms. If you're multiracial, you get categorized into one box, multiracial, regardless of how you were identifying, right? So some of that agency gets pulled away from people, from how they complete these forms for, to self-identify, and then how it gets truncated. And this can change not only what we know about our campuses, but what decisions we make based off of this similar data. And so walking through this, you can see some of the issues with just, in this case, one campus's approach, and then how it has to be aggregated for federal classifications and reporting standards. So again, there's a lot of issues about who's in one campus, what do we know about their experiences, what do we know about students who might identify similarly in another campus. We're seeing that these reporting standards can change depending on the campus, and that can really impact how we understand what's going on across the US when it comes to racism and higher education.
Thanks.
Hopefully that was satisfactory. I believe, JD, you have the next comment and question.
I believe so, sir. It's good to see you, and I'm happy to be here on the panel with these wonderful people and scholarly faculty. I guess my question, I enjoyed chapter 2, like along with Dr. Ford and all the comments she had to say as well. I think for me, one of the things that struck me though was in the appendix when you were talking about the methodology for examining campus climate research. And I'll go into a little bit of a background. The reason why I'm interested in this, and I want to know why you want to include it, but for me, I know I could start off with I grew up in Phoenix in a predominantly white neighborhood, but my parents worked for a small college called American Indian College. And so since the time I was born, I was around a higher education institution. My parents would take us to different reservations throughout my childhood, recruiting Native students, trying to create access, trying to help students come back to school. It was like some one-on-one recruiting I've never seen in my life, maybe outside of athletics. But we would be staying at people's houses, random people we didn't know. And then sometimes my dad would just be sitting there in the living room talking to grandparents, uncles, aunties about like, hey, you know, if you send your student to our college, I'll be the one, I'll look after them. And I think about that experience and I reflect on that because when I started reading the literature as a graduate student and now faculty, I started realizing a lot of the literature wasn't reflective of the experiences of what I had seen throughout my childhood, the college students I had seen while I was at American Indian College as an undergrad. And so I was like, why aren't these experiences reflected in the research? And it kind of drew me to the place we are now within the methods section of like saying, all right, what are like some of these indigenous statistics approaches to the research? How do we begin to measure that? And then also like, how do you like also incorporate some kind of the critical quantitative methods? And so when I saw that section in your book about like a methodology examining campus climate, in my mind, I was like, oh, perfect, because there's not very many places you could go. And many folks, as you know, I'm sure your students or whoever it may be are like, where do I start? Like, you know, it's like, it's not a button in like SPSS that you're like, all right, critical quantitative methods, go, you know, let me put that in the analysis. And so I guess for me, I just wanted to know a little bit more about your motivation to include that in your book.
Yeah, right. And thanks for sharing a little bit more about how you came to the question. It's really informative. And I think using your example, that's I want to say a similar way of how I was approaching the research literature around race and campus climates, right? There seems to be a lot of promise, but then how do people use that, right? And so the examination of campus climate research uses a framework developed by Silvia Hurtado and colleagues over a decade plus of research and literature review to look at the components of campus climate. And so I use that framework as a way of kind of backtracking and say, since some of this original research by Silvia Hurtado and her colleagues were published beginning in the early 90s, how have things evolved in how we study campus climates, right? And so it wasn't like I was coming up with something new per se. I just wanted to know, like, how have we, you know, how well have we stuck to this idea that this literature, this approach is supposed to help us change our institutions for the better, right? And from that, it led me down, well, how do we use this in our methods, right? Where do we stop short, or maybe where do we need to, you know, kind of focus a little bit more on there? And, you know, part of, yeah, the frustrations, right, that you're mentioning with students, where you're kind of sitting there and you're like, how do I do this? And so I was trying to do this, and then I had to do it again and do it again. And it was a lot of fits and starts. I was lucky to come across a couple of examples that are mentioned in the appendix, one being by Nolan Cabrera, who's at the University of Arizona as well, who used critical race theory as a framework for analyzing literatures, right? And I was like, okay, this makes sense. Now I just need to figure out what's the most important part. And we're talking about numbers, we're talking about methods. And so as much as we want to talk about how these things work across an article, like sometimes somebody will cite something because they were told in a review, like you need to cite so-and-so, but they don't really engage in it. So the methodology for research articles is really what I was wanting to kind of focus in on, like how do people do this? And how could that maybe change why it matters, or maybe why it's not mattering or informing things as much as we would like. And that's kind of how I started to reorganize and focus the analyses for that section, where you sit down and you have thousands of articles that technically talk about campus climate, but then you're like, well, let me just focus in on certain types of journals that are always cited in these conversations, right? Then where do we want to focus in on the things in terms of like empirical articles, methods? And it just kind of helped me truncate it down to something more manageable, but also kind of resonated with the points that I was trying to raise in the book. So it was a very drawn out process, and many times a very frustrating process, but it was something that I learned a lot from, because as you know, we've all talked before, we enjoy our numbers, but sometimes we need to make sure that we have a very good theoretical framework and basis for why we're employing methodologies in certain ways. And in this case, I wanted to make sure that I was showing that this is another kind of way you could do that to evaluate, how we could do things better.
Great, thank you.
Katherine, I believe you're up.
Yes, so I think sort of similarly, and this ties really well into the question that I have. I was similarly interested in both the methodology and then chapter 3, which for those of you who maybe have the book in front of you or not, the chapter is titled The Other Climate Science. And part of the reason why I'm interested in this, obviously, as Carson, when you read my bio, I look at organizations, I look at organizational function, or maybe arguably more dysfunction, right? And so part of what I appreciated in this chapter particularly, and then from there really sort of dissecting, well, how is the field studied this theoretical model and the conceptualization of campus climates, is how do we measure organizational function and dysfunction in sort of manifesting and creating the conditions that are harming students, faculty, and staff, right? And so that was, for me, part of the reason why I was drawn so much to the chapter, and and thinking about the book, for those of you who are interested in maybe reading it or incorporating it in your classes or syllabi, your research or dissertations, etc. I particularly appreciated the book on 2 fronts. The first was from the methodological section of strategies of how you can think about conducting literature reviews, but also the overarching narrative of how has a term evolved and impacted the field. And I think that that's something that we need to look at, because as researchers, we often spend time talking to each other. And so I think that Carson's analysis of how the field has changed, but also stayed the same in many ways, is really important for us to think about what might we be missing or overlooking or adding into the conversation, particularly as we think about the advances in technology. And part of the reason why I also bring that up, and why I also liked this book in particular, is that in the same ways that Carson provides the history of how quantification has happened, I think he also did a really great job providing the context of the technological limitations, right? We used to use gendered binaries in many ways for that classification and categorization, because we only had systems of 1s and 0s with computers. Now, as technology is advancing, that has also allowed us to think more creatively. And so part of that means, and the second reason why I like this chapter in particular, is that you implicitly both called us out and called us in to be more creative in how we do research. That we don't just need to be thinking about the standard ways of quantification through and quantitative analysis through regression, and then qual methods through ethnographies or observations, but thinking about how do we marry both? How do we do both in ways that are a little bit more creative and better understand particularly the organizational dynamic? And so that's just, I really just wanted to highlight that as something that I really appreciated and enjoyed. My question, which has nothing to do with those things, but one of the things that we had discussed prior to the book, or prior to this to this session was that I really enjoyed the appendix so much that I wish that it had been a separate chapter. I wished it had been a chapter on its own. And so I was wondering, because this is a rather succinct book, so for those of you who have it, it's, you know, comparative to all the other books I have, it's actually on the shorter side. If you had more pages to add, and if you had, for example, another chapter, what would you have wished you had included, and sort of, and going through that process, right, of like what had been on the chopping block for you?
It's a really interesting question. There's always something left on the chopping block, right? One of the original takes, and I kind of do this in the second chapter that Carly was mentioning about campus representation and categories, was trying to provide a fuller exploration of what racial stratification in and of higher education looks like, right? One of the things that, as much as I'm focusing on how institutions can do something better, oftentimes institutions compare themselves to each other, right? And quantification can skew how we really understand our positioning and whether we're doing well or not, right? People ask for bars, like, how do I know that things are more equitable? And it's like, well, sometimes you have to keep asking, how do we know that it's inequitable, right? Like, it's an ever-evolving process. And so if we think about what we've seen on social media a lot, or maybe have landed in our emails, quantification changes a lot of things, like, say, rankings, and how people and institutions in particular compare themselves based off of these rankings. Like, all of a sudden somebody's top 20. What does that actually mean? Well, what we find in the research is that by quantifying something and relying on these approaches so heavily, people end up changing what they do to look better in the numbers. And that's concerning, right? And so part of the conversation I would have liked to include a little bit more on is why this matters and how it matters, and how this could necessarily be a detriment to, you know, collaborations among institutions to try to do better together. Carly's work is actually really great at this, at looking at how racial and ethnic representation and data differs by, are we talking about for-profit colleges? Are we talking about colleges based off of selectivity? What is that? How does this change the conversation? And how do people maybe mess with the numbers a little bit to look better without actually doing better, right? This is all part of stratification. It's about trying to get status and resources. And so trying to build that in a little bit more would have been really helpful, not only for readers, but also for me, because that's one component that I ended up leaving out because it wasn't fitting into the flow as much. So thus the succinctness, as you were mentioning. The other part was trying to dive in a little bit more to the literature. Like, I focus in on the methods, and, you know, one critique could be, well, you know, some people do bring out the conversation. Like, one point that I raise is through our methodological choices, we end up tending towards approaches that individualize inequality. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody doesn't try to bring that back out in the discussion. But anybody that knows anything about empirical research and how it's reviewed through the peer review process, if you talk about data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, a majority of your comments are going to come about that. And then at the end, you kind of bring it back out. And so oftentimes a majority of the work is all focused on these sections, right? It doesn't mean that the other ones don't matter. It doesn't mean that the literature that they build on doesn't matter. But oftentimes the conversation centers on these methods. And so sometimes when we're writing these manuscripts, we forget to bring it back out, right? And so what are the ways that our methods don't necessarily do that? So being able to compare perhaps what happens in the methods with the discussion section, like, do we see a change in how people talk about these things to where it's not so much about small groups or individual, you know, outcomes. It's more, you know, about organizational changes that need to be made. That's very likely, but again, how do our methods set us up for that is something I wanted to dive in a little bit more in the future. So perhaps that Perhaps that's the next article. Let me write that down.
Yes, thank you. And I look forward to the future articles for that.
Me too.
It gets for me to a great point about this book, and probably into the fourth chapter as well, of as we spend time shifting away from individual actions and behaviors that we need to address and thinking about systems organizationally, right? I think the larger question then becomes, well, then what do we do as on an institutional level, but also very much as a call-in for ourselves who are very much a part of this institution now, right? And so that's something that you left me thinking a lot about, of the implications of how I even teach my research foundations classes and things like that.
I think that is a nice kind of segue into what this might be able to be used for a little bit more. Again, there's only so many pages in a book, and I'll just kind of use this as one example about institutional capacities to utilize more critical frameworks in the analyses that can inform institutional decision making, and that's not just about like quantitative methods or qualitative methods. It's about everything, right? Like, who is given the responsibility to do these analyses? What are their trainings? Who are they collaborating with? Are they by themselves, right? Sometimes you'll see people conduct equity analyses, but they're like one person in one unit that might be the quote unquote diversity unit, but isn't actually connected to any of the other key stakeholders that could help us kind of push our institutions further. And that's something that I think would be really helpful. The other kind of institutional capacity is brought up by the Institute for Critical Quantitative Computational and Mixed Methodologies, right? Otis Johnson Jr. and Ebony McGee and Ezekiel Dixon Roman have a really important kind of framework and approach for trying to push not just one field, but all the fields in organizations to do better with methodologies and understand theoretically why these things matter, right? As a praxis, because how we do things and how we approach them are very much, as Diddy was, using as a great example, informed by our lived experiences and our perceptions, right? So how do we do this better, right? Through, kind of bringing those back into like our classes. Some students want these things, but they don't have access to them, right? And so, bringing that institutional capacity up would be really helpful. But Carly, I saw your hand fly up real quick.
I just wanted to frame that in a slightly different way, which would be to think, if you are a scholarly academic researcher, or you're a student affairs practitioner or an institutional researcher, whenever you're making decisions about race data, you are taking part in a racial project. You are socially constructing, right? You're making decisions about where group boundaries are that will impact the way resources flow, what kind of political groups can form or not. An example of that would be, do Afro-Latinx students, do they have, where are they in your data? Are they just in with your Latinx students, or will they get the invitation to be with the Black students on campus for different activities? This is being hosted by the University of Michigan, which in the Detroit suburbs has a huge population of Arab students. And I think about when they arrive at UMichigan, are they going to be in your white student number when their lived experience on campus is one where they are not racialized as white in any way, shape, or form? But the way that IPEDS works currently is that Arab students are lumped in with white students. So these are decisions that campus people, middle level people who don't have sociology degrees probably are making, that really impact students' abilities to connect in groups, see themselves. Do I have time for one more example? I'll give you one more example. Here at Penn State, the dean of the College of Education decided she wanted to have a lunch with faculty of color and asked the institutional research office to give her a list of faculty of color. And so in institutional research, they understood that to mean anyone who didn't check white would be invited. So you can understand that that might be a knee-jerk thinking, but if you think a little bit about how race works, that includes international faculty who are from Russia and France, who racialize themselves as whites, were invited to the faculty of color lunch. And then people who had checked Latinx and white were left out of the invitation, even though they themselves thought of themselves as people of color, as Latinx people. And then anyone who was mixed race with white as a part of their identity. So the Black white people, the Asian white people were also left out of the invitation. So this very simple sort of institutional research data decision had real consequences. One, for how these international faculty members sort of questioning their racial position in the United States, but people who have lived lives as people of color losing this opportunity to sit at the table with the dean, which I think is a real opportunity and a resource. So those are just some examples of how thinking these things through and your role in the social construction of race has real lived consequences.
I'll just add in, this also goes to a point that was kind of, intermixed with your comment, Carly, is, we hear this acronym of URM, right? Underrepresented racial minority. And it is used very, very narrowly and in exclusionary ways that can completely dismiss in similar, kind of capacities as what you're saying through the data of trying to recognize that racism hits a lot of folks, even those that are seen as privileged, right? That this isn't, just an easy way of trying to group people together, that oftentimes that things are about, who's not part of the group more than who's in the group, right? And for understanding things. So, Bumi Thakur and Ebony McGee have a great piece a few years ago about how common views of who's underrepresented in STEM fields exclude Asian Pacific Islander students and their experiences, that because we see higher representation in certain fields, that automatically means that everything's okay. And as Tony Jack has eloquently put it, diversity doesn't mean that you're racism free, right? And that's something that's really important to kind of keep in mind, that with these groupings, like what you're saying, it can be really exclusionary quite quickly. And people won't even know it that are making the decisions, but their impact is still felt, right? And so that actually, leads me to both JD and Katherine. What are some other kinds of ideas about what institutions could do, not necessarily just about the numbers, but perhaps how they understand and examine the experiences and who they're talking with, and what the aims are? Like, what are some ideas that you kind of came away from, maybe not just with this book, but in some of your other reflections of some of the research you're doing, that you would like people to just kind of sit with and later incorporate instead of just sit with it, right? How can things change?
Thanks. I know for me, one of the things that I always tend to think about is whose values are we measuring? And I think that's one of the things that the book, along with in my own work, that's something that I always want to consider. I think Janko Paris in Culturally Sustained Pedagogies had said that the values of the students need to be the outcomes that we measure. So the outcomes need to be based on the values of the people that we're, serving. And I always keep that in consideration, especially within Indigenous communities, because when I go back into my own tribal community or other tribal communities and I ask them, how do you measure the success of a college student? I could tell you probably about 99% of them don't mention first to second year persistence. They don't mention graduation rates. They don't mention GPA. They say, how much is that person giving back to the tribal community? How much are they giving back? How much are, what are they contributing to the nation building or economic development of the community. And when I think about those outcomes, I'm like, we're not anywhere close to measuring that, and especially at an institutional level, like, those are things that aren't necessarily of consideration at the institution. So for me, that's where I find an opportunity of saying like, well, maybe in my own research, that's what I should be measuring. Not to say we're getting rid of first, second year persistence or graduation rates or whatever it may be, but in addition to, and I think for me, that's kind of what the book kind of further brings out to me is like, just what are we measuring? And I know there was a question about students too, as well, about like what some advice we give to them. And I think that's right along with what I would say is like, think about the values and whose values we're measuring through all of this. So.
I think in addition to this question of whose values are we measuring, the question of like, what is the ultimate point? And I think about that often for, for example, the book White Logic, White Methods was life-changing for me in many ways in my career as a scholar. And thinking a lot about, is the goal of educational research and educational equity just really trying to get to decrease gaps so that student outcomes are the same as white student outcomes? Is that really what we're doing? And by centering students and white students as the comparison group, is that not what we're just reinforcing? And so it really has gotten me to take a step back and think about what is the point of the research. And as we talk about education gaps or limited opportunities, right, that what are we actually trying to get at? And obviously, because I'm an organizational theorist, I want us to be moving away from, what Sabini Anama talks about pathologizing people, but really thinking about how are we pathologizing and interrogating the systems and conditions that exist. So that's one thing. And so then related to that, when I work with, different administrators or, particularly senior administrators, where their first question is about when students are protesting, well, how do we create change? Or when I work with student activists who also ask, well, how are we creating change on the campus? I think it's important for us to be incorporating more of the history of these individual campuses. I know that a common practice that we use oftentimes is benchmarking, right? We compare different institutions against ourselves to see how we measure up. But I also like to hold the institution accountable to how they measure up with the promises that were made, that they themselves have said. So I think a lot about the cyclical ways that student demands look eerily similar from the ones that were in 1980, 1960, right? That what has changed in that? And so whenever institutions are like, well, how do we move forward? I ask them, when was the last time you did an audit in meeting the demands that were given to you? And that's actually where I like to start a lot of these conversations. And that's a way for me to think about how do we use quantitative methods to help institutions measure themselves to the accountability that they promised, particularly to students, but also thinking about that relationship then with the larger community. So I think about, for example, when we talk about what is the institution or who is the institution, right? We think about the boundaries of the campus, but in reality, universities also hold incredible purchasing power, right? And so as we talk about, addressing issues of inequity, I want to know where the board is making their decisions of which vendors they're supporting, right? How are we impacting the surrounding borders of the university and boundaries, but also pushing that and really sort of re-examining what that looks like. And so those are some of the things that I think about and sort of think about within the concept of the diversity numbers, as well as like, what is the campus and as always, what's the point?
And that actually is the last thing that I did not get in there that I was originally wanting to put in, was more that what is the campus connection, or what's the university connection with communities, right? There's literal and physical gating off of communities that are seen as outsiders now for some institutions, right? And that doesn't just, like you said, stop at the campus and the physical campus. That also means stopping recruiting in some places, right? Not seeing some students as viable applicants or worthy, if you want to read it that way, of admission, right? And that sends some very strong signals to different students and communities about what institutions really value and how they're living up to these demands. Like you were saying, again, post the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, right? Lots of institutions made some pretty bold statements and commitments. But as you mentioned, we've seen this before, and some have seemed to be doing better, right? But only time will tell. Like in some cases, when somebody says we're going to double the number of faculty of color that are on our campus in 5 years, it's like, you've been an institution for how long now? And you said you're going to be able to fix what you haven't done in just 5 years. But also, what does that actually look like? It's not just about increasing diversity in applicant pools. It's literally changing policies and structures to be more supportive, to not be combative towards people, right? But again, that's part of the community as well, is trying to figure out how do institutions connect to one another, but people who are not in higher education. I think, I've had this brought up before, and perhaps you have as well, where people will think that just because you happen to be a faculty member or a researcher in a higher education institution, that you're somehow disconnected from society. And that's not necessarily true, but you can see how, given the history of our institutions, people would think that way, right? That we do disconnect in certain ways. And some of this happens to be with our methodologies too, right? Like, how do we study people? How do we disconnect ourselves from that kind of community connection, right? That's really an important efforts as well. So thank you, Katherine, and also thank you, JD, for the focusing on values, right? And how does that get incorporated into our methods? Those are both really important points. So I know there might be some questions from the audience, so I'll have Dr. Colquitt join us again.
Thank you very much. And we are going to transition to ask a couple of questions. One of the first that we received is, the University of Michigan began allowing students, faculty, and staff to change their race and ethnicity identification whenever they want to. This seems like a great thing from a sociological perspective, but a nightmare from an analytical one. Have you seen anyone using data like these, and how does it work in practice?
So I'll just jump in real quick and say, see chapter 2, because that's part of the issue that iPads has had, as an example. So in 1997, the OMB that dictates the federal reporting classifications for all agencies changed how they wanted to analyze race and ethnicity and collect data. And one of the things that we talked about is that the 2000 census was the first time people could select more than one box. So that was coming starting in 1997. However, iPads, as you mentioned, it's a little cumbersome, and we can say old school. And so they had to change how they were collecting data. But as I mentioned before, they don't actually allow for multiple reporting. They are a one box group, just like everything that's happened since 1790 with the census, right? So what happened is in 2008, 2009, 10 years after 1997, they were given the directive to make the changes, they came out with new race and ethnicity categories. So what they ended up doing was adding multiracial, multi-ethnic as a category. But in effect, the way people have to report is anybody that selects more than one race or ethnicity have to be put back in that box. So again, the infrastructure, the data infrastructure doesn't necessarily allow for that to happen. And so the University of California also provides that interesting window that Carly was pointing out, that they allow for multiple selection for race and ethnicity data. And that can give you a different window, but you also have to know who you're talking about in terms of sheer numbers of people, right? And how that can be reflected differently in the data, right? Not just through the categories, but literal people. So part of that is trying to figure out how can our institutions, as we adopt these broader kinds of approaches, how can we better utilize them, but also, as Carly mentioned, not fall into the same traps of what, as a racial project, this is. right? That they're still going to be used to dictate opportunities and resources for different student groups or for different programs based off of the way they're analyzed. So there's a lot of other considerations, not just with the categories, but how they're used, and also who gets to say whether a category gets to exist. Are you listening to students, right? Or are you listening to certain faculty, or are you not? Are you just looking at what maybe your peer is doing and say, that's a great idea? Maybe for them it is, but maybe it wouldn't work the same way for you. So, that's one thing to keep in mind, but I'll definitely open it up to the panelists to kind of jump in on that.
I am super interested in this because I haven't heard this as an idea that you can select one race or races coming in, but then you have the ability. I mean, what is cool about it is that it acknowledges racial fluidity. So what we know from sociologists is that people's racial identities can change and often does change as they get older or in different contexts. So in some ways, this is honoring kind of racial fluidity. It would be cool. I would love to analyze this data. So the UC system allows you to change your gender. So they understand gender fluidity, but they actually don't let their students change race because they want to be able to show graduation rates and persistence by race in a way that they don't feel like they need to do by gender. But what I think would be most interesting is that at highly selective institutions, there are often high rates of students who decide not to disclose their race or ethnicity, and they come in the data as race unknown. In higher ed, you're allowed to be race unknown in a way that in K-12 data, you're not. And so I would be curious if people are applying to the University of Michigan as race unknown, and then later sort of choose a race because they perhaps feel like it would have, erroneously think that giving a race would play into an admissions decision. So anyway, if we can get Michigan data, that would be a really interesting project to do, especially on the race unknown and then later providing a race.
To jump in really quickly, because I want to also be mindful of time. I have not done this from large institutional scales. I've done this in a smaller scale when I was a student, piloting survey data and then double barreling questions where people could select multiple things, and then received my survey answers and was like, oh no, this is incredibly messy. And as I think the question had indicated, right, a nightmare. And yet one of the things that I really like to anchor to is that numbers are messy. The decisions that we make are messy. And I really want to go back to what Carly had pointed out, right? That every decision that we make is part of an agenda and a story that we're telling. And so for me, in that messiness, what I want within quantitative work, I want more of the explanations. And I think as a field, we've gotten accustomed to within quantitative research, as we talk about our research designs, we say, we use the 5 race category because of blank, and then we add a citation and that's it. But I want us to complicate that more and provide more of those explanations of why we're making the decisions that we're making, right? So when folks say we're using URM or underrepresented minority groups, I want them to explicitly say, who are you talking about? Why did you make that decision? Because oftentimes, as I see, for example, Asians and particularly Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and specifically Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander groups being sort of invisibilized in that and not included within this category, I want to know how these decisions are being made. And if, for example, you are studying the impact of racism and you say, I'm only looking at URM, and I decided to put Asians and whites together because that provides a stronger significance value, right? Then what is the story we're actually saying? What are the implications of the research that we're doing? In the same ways that, for example, there was a study that some of my colleagues and I did about the impact of summer bridge programs, and it said that there was no effect on their efficacy, but we know that that's not true. But if we put this data out there, then what is that story? What is the implications we're doing? And so we had to take a moment to step back. We pulled the project and halted it to say, are we measuring actually what we're measuring? And so I think in this is, again, this question of what's the point, what's the story we're trying to share, as well as a moment for us too of the sense of urgency that we feel to produce and produce and produce needs to also be halted. And we have to take those moments to think about what are the implications of the research as we say that these numbers are here, because we also know, as much as we are trying to fight against numbers being used as the evidence to make these decisions, that a lot of our policymakers still anchor to those numbers. And so I think as researchers, we have to take a greater form of accountability to think about how can our numbers be used for good, but also to repeal a lot of the equity-oriented agendas that we're trying to push for. And so those are things that I think about often. I don't remember what the original question was, so I'm pretty sure I tangented, but that's, so sorry.
No, I definitely think you responded to the question. Before I move on to the next question, Dr. Lopez, did you want to comment on this?
Oh, I mean, everybody said some great words. So I don't want to interrupt, but I think just to go along with that, I think even within indigenous communities and IPEDs and federal and institutional data set, it's somewhat similar in the sense of like there's, over 500 federally recognized tribes. If you include state recognized, it's over 600. All sovereign nations with their independent governments. And, they're lumped into one category despite having different languages, culture, and identity and experiences being indigenous, but that's how we're measuring it. And I think you could say the similar thing with the Latinx community, being Puerto Rican or Cuban or Mexican and whatever that identity may be, or even indigenous coming from Mexico or wherever else it may be. And just trying to disaggregate that data and going back to an earlier point of wanting to use the right comparison groups. And not just always constantly measuring it against white folks. And I think that's something that this conversation has led me to think a little bit more about as well. So thank you.
Thanks. I really think that's a good lead into another question that we had. What advice do you, panelists, host, author, have for those of us who teach statistics or data science to students, particularly if we teach students how to do statistical practice and consulting more generally? What should those of us who model human data in education, health, etc., raise awareness on in our field and amongst our colleagues?
I'll reverse this order and open it up to the panelists first and then jump in at the end, because I know each of you have some really important insights on these conversations since we've had them many, many times before.
I can go, I guess. I think I'll make mine short. I think the important thing is that when you're talking about race differences, they're not neutral. So we're not talking about race difference, or gender difference. We're talking about the effects of racism, the barriers of discrimination that are playing out between racial groups. So I think in thinking, this is a quant crit kind of like 101. Yeah, so maybe just read quant crit, but that's it. I think sometimes in statistics classes, we think about these social identities as neutral and natural, and then the differences between them are neutral, when that's not the case. The differences are the result of societal barriers and disadvantages that are piling up.
I think for me, I would go back to besides also measuring like the values, something that I would consider teaching in statistics courses is an earlier comment that Dr. Cho made about what story do you want to tell and who is it representing. I know for me, my mother, she grew up in a one-bedroom mud house. She's 67 years old. She was raised in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. She had quite a tragic childhood, being abused, but it culminated with her father passing away at the age of 12 from alcohol poisoning just beneath their mesquite tree. That same year, though, there was a group of Native American college students, though, led by the man that came from a college, and they met my mom and they said, you could go to college, you can do this. And it was the first time she saw somebody look like them, smell like her, eat like her. and she was happy. And at the age of 12, she effectively changed the legacy of our family and went to college and made that decision. I'm going to go to college when I become that age. And when she was 17, she flew out to Texas. But I say all that to say, you know, when we're measuring these types of programs, whether it be a group of students going to recruit other students and seeing what the effect are, or seeing what mentoring does on the outcomes of persistence, realize like the impact they could have on generations of folks. That's why I'm here. So my sisters went to college. You know, my mom, she met my dad in the 4th grade because he failed 4th grade, and you know, she got him in line, and you know, he went to college. And so I think about that impact all the time whenever I'm looking at the data. And for me, making that real to students is very important, because you don't want to lose track within these numbers. And so that's something I would add to this conversation.
I think of 2, maybe 3 things. One is I think about, as we talk about like on the numbers side, right, and the data, I think a lot about the construction of it. And I'm gonna put JD on the spot, but JD has a wonderful article about factor analysis and going back and adjusting and changing survey questions with the communities that he's working with. And that article was really important for me in thinking about, as we talk about piloting data, as we talk about doing surveys, right? Who are the surveys going to, and have we checked in to say that, is this actually measuring what we're measuring? And having those types of feedback loops that are so critically important, because ultimately, in the same ways that we argue, like, who is our research going to? Who are we listening to before we even make those decisions about what we're deciding to measure? So I've spent a lot of time now thinking a lot about survey redesign and why we need to be redesigning things. Again, that opens up the nightmare that we talked about in the previous question, but I want to welcome that, because it's necessary for us to be doing, as technology is advancing, as our metrics are and our models are advancing. Why aren't our surveys advancing in the same way? Why aren't we thinking about questions in more creative ways? The other point I want to bring up is, I think, so I hated statistics, and I should very much clarify that my dad is a theoretical statistician. And that's part of the reason. It's complicated for other reasons too, because I hate math. In that, I have redefined that relationship. But in those conversations of understanding statistics, part of my fear was that statistics was both a function of gatekeeping for me as too difficult, but also a function of gatekeeping because I felt that it was concrete. And one of the things that I've learned with books like, I wonder if I can, nope, I don't have it here, I'm so sorry. But there's a book called The Cult of Statistics, The Cult of Statistical Significance. And I really enjoy that book because it helped remind me that in the same ways that our fields have changed and evolved, or even terms like climate have changed and evolved, statistical significance and these things that we anchor to in educational research or in social science research are also up for debate. That those are not always the things that we have anchored to. P-values being 0.05 is not a concept that has existed for all of eternity. It's still a relatively new concept, which means that it is also up for debate, because ultimately we're still getting back to what's the story we're trying to share. And so those are things I think about often. And then the other thing, particularly the third thing, is in teaching statistics classes or working in statistics groups, to really sort of anchor away from, again, what JD mentioned, right? It's not a click and then all of a sudden you're moving from, you know, quant to quant crit or crit quant. Like it's not just a click, it has to be messy in the same ways that I think often qualitative research is messy, that quantitative research is just as messy. We've just been a little lazy about it and taken things as, oh, let's just copy, paste, and apply, copy this code over. And that's not the way we should be doing it now. And so part of that also means I, for example, and some of my colleagues here at Miami, we challenge a lot about, can you teach an intro to statistics class in one semester? And we would argue probably not. Like in the same ways that our qualitative introduction classes have been a year long, we also argue that statistics and quantitative methods classes also need to be longer, because we're doing a disservice to students saying, hey, this is the code, this is what you got to click, and then these are the results you're going to get. And in doing that, we're reifying the same problems.
And it sounds like a cop-out, but I'll co-sign all 3 of your comments and just add that one of the things that my students, when I've taught statistics before, that they have the hardest time with is they would run away from biostatistics and think that a social statistics class will be easier than biostats. And then they find out that the interpretations are hard, right? That the numbers can mean something that impacts them, similar to what JD was mentioning, right? That the relatability of this is really important to convey to people, that you're talking about what's going on with somebody's lives, right? X equals 500,000. 500,000 what? 500,000 excess deaths, right? Like that hits, right? It's not just about, I made sure that it was statistically significant. I went and I searched out those asterisks in those articles. You're looking for, as what Katherine was mentioning with the statistical significance, the oomph, right? The effects. Like sometimes our analyses get in the way of actually seeing the lives and livelihoods of people and why that matters. And oftentimes that also gets conveyed through our pedagogical practices and statistics courses that could really help, not just with the quantitative literacy about how to read numbers, but how to read them clearly as a part of our social world too, right? We do a good job of like, make sure you do these things, but part of that is still being an engaged citizen in a global society and understanding what people's lived experiences are through these numbers. So that would be the one little addition that I would add on to that.
Wow, thank you very much. Dr. Byrd, I think we have about time for one more question, and I'll shoot that just to you in respect of time. What sorts of universities are more likely or less likely to make policy changes based on the result of climate studies? I think this is something that your book spoke to and your experience could shed some light on.
So the easy answer from the book perspective is, I don't know. And the more applicable answer is, I still don't know beyond the book, because again, what progress looks like, how it's measured, and in comparison to similar to what we were just talking about, changes, right? We can say that somebody wants to increase faculty diversity or recruitment of diverse students, however defined, right? In some cases, people will say, they've actually signed on to these compacts, I'm not sure if you've seen this, where they say we're going to try to reach 40% diverse students. But what they end up doing is conflating race and social class together in a really detrimental way, to say that diverse means poor and non-white, right? Whatever that means, right? But people are like, yes, this is great. And that's a way for institutions to get away from showing progress in certain ways behind these approaches, right? And so there's a lot of campuses that are making efforts. It's just, which ones are you wanting to focus on, right? Just because you get some great results on an annual campus climate survey doesn't mean that you're actually getting that for everybody. And sometimes you have to, again, go into one of the points that we've made here, data's messy. And at the same time, you got to realize when you need to stop analyzing numbers and start talking to people, right? At what point are you willing to say, I need to go and hear more and just listen, right? And learn and find out what's going on with different groups on campus. There's a lot of really important work that's being done, but we just have to say, for whom are we focusing on and whom are we wanting to support in certain ways around our campus climates? That would be the long and short of what campuses are doing better. It depends on what you want to focus on.
Wow. Thank you very much. This has been fantastic. Today's event was Data Don't Speak for Themselves, a panel discussion, presentation, if you will, that highlighted the recently published text Behind the Diversity Numbers by Dr. W. Carson Byrd. Thank you so much, Dr. Byrd. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Katherine Cho, Dr. Carly Ford, Dr. J.P. Lopez. The goal of today's discussion was to highlight the theoretical concepts and the current research associated with the use of statistics within systems of higher education and the adverse effect the misuse of these numbers can have on minoritized student groups. Again, help us build this and other NCID programming by completing our post-event survey, displaying in your browser immediately after the discussion ends the contact information for our moderator and panelists, is also available at the end of this presentation. Continue this conversation online using the hashtag Data Don't Speak, no apostrophe, that's at Data Don't Speak, and follow us on Twitter at UMISH_NCID. Thank you for your participation in this event. If you're interested in learning more about the Diversity Scholars Network, you can find information on our UMISH website. Our application process is currently underway, and we invite faculty across all ranks, tracks, and appointment types to apply. Again, thank you so much. Have a fantastic day, and thank you.